One of the leading sources of Amazon candidates for AWS for rather senior roles is Microsoft candidates. And I thought that since more and more of you are asking me of advice on how do you go about preparing for both telephonic but more interestingly for on-site interviews, I thought of sharing with you some common patterns that I notice, especially within these specific scenarios of someone working for Microsoft looking for jobs with Amazon. And the first thing you must keep in mind is that as Mr. Nadella recently launched Microsoft's 3 leadership principles, Amazon is very strict as well when it comes to leadership principles. And when they say that you will be screened on those 14 leadership principles, they really mean it. And truth be said, more on the on-site interview, where they will actually score you on the leadership principles more than the phone interview, but still also for the phone interview, it is a very relevant exercise for you to read them a couple of times and maybe, look out for a couple of behavioral questions related to these principles and really take them more seriously than you would otherwise do. The other very interesting piece of advice that I noticed is that it's easier than you think to come across as arrogant in an interview with Amazon, simply because the emphasis on leadership is a lot more than you would assume it would be. And there are a couple of ways that you might want to diagnose such a behavior. The first one would be on whether you use I versus we too much. For example, at Salesforce, they screen specifically candidates. They talk too much about I versus we, and saying too much I did this comes across as arrogant and an disqualifier oftentimes in interviews. So using we might actually play to your advantage in the sense that you might come across as a team player. Another way you might come across as slightly arrogant maybe is not to provide strong answers to questions such as what's your weakness. For example, if you spin it over like turning a positive into a negative, like I work too much, like it cannot be a weakness, right? Or if you start dodging the failure stories, like if you're not able to come up with a proper failure story. So try to prepare these things in advance so you minimize the chance of coming across as arrogant. Or another way that would be a questionable mark would be being overly negative about these things. And usually negativity is never good in job interviews. So this is also something you will want to keep in mind. And finally, last but not least, it's when you try to impress or when impressing becomes distressing. So some people, very smart people, because most of the candidates that I know coming from Microsoft are really smart people, might unintentionally come across the wrong way when you want to impress in such interviews. So you would also want to keep this in mind pretty carefully. So as a final conclusion, you should take this behavioral interviewing thing seriously. Like, you shouldn't invest too much time into it, especially for a phone interview. But for the on-site interview, it becomes, a must-have if you want, because they go as far as scoring you on these leadership principles. And really try to be serious about those leadership principles, because oftentimes it's people that don't really understand what those principles actually mean. And that's why, they could do better in these Amazon interviews.